Hey, we're reading the whole Bible this year, and today is day 246. That puts us on Ezekiel 23 and 24 and proves that the Bible is an R-rated NC-17 book at times, and this is one of those times. So parents, use caution when bringing these passages up around your kids. If you listen to it on audio, you may want to have headphones in, look at it ahead of time before you just play it to your children. I think it's worth, if they're at an age where they can engage this kind of stuff, it's a good time to talk through it with them. Better they hear it with some explanation from you than, from a kid at school or TV or some random person on the internet, right? That said, let's get into it. Okay, so the first 35 verses of Ezekiel 23 use metaphor to talk about the idolatry of Israel and Judah. It does all of this in the metaphor of two sisters who are prostitutes and adulterous women. Aholah represents Samaria and Oholibah represents Jerusalem. Jerusalem has often been talked about in personified terms as a woman who is unfaithful to the Lord, to her husband. And so now he's taking it all the way into two different names and, really treating it as if these are two people. And then it has some of the most graphic sexual content in the entire Bible. I'm not going to get into all of it. Just know that there are certain things represented that are about Babylon. When it talks about returning to her first love and that type of thing, that's talking about going back to Egypt. And he does kind of say these things. The second half of Ezekiel 23 is a bit of an explanation of what he really meant by all of that, that in the same way that I said you prostituted yourselves and your bodies and all of this, you did this spiritually with the idols that you worshiped. You exposed yourself and did horrible, horrendous things that were meant for me and sold them to other false gods, just the way that I described that with false men and abandoning your husband. And so it's highly graphic. Don't recommend for children, and even just be warned if you're a little squeamish or this kind of thing bothers you. One, I would encourage you to try and appreciate the depth of betrayal and disgust that the Lord feels over the idolatry of Israel, in this case, Israel and Judah, and in any of his people. When we turn away from him, it's as if we were doing all of these things that he describes here. And it's disgusting. It's offensive. There's a deep, soul-wrenching betrayal to it. And that is laid out very graphically in Ezekiel 23. Chapter 24 deals with a couple of prophecies against Jerusalem, as per usual. This one is placed right as the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem happens on the first day. The Lord says, on this date, the siege of Jerusalem is happening. Here's what I want you to do. Cook meat, cook it until it is complete, take a really great dish. This represents the people of Israel. Really good, should be perfect. All the right spices, do all the right things. He said, but just cook it until it's completely charred and burned and blackened, and it just ruins the pot almost. And then take that pot and place it on the coals and heat it up until every bit of impurity is burned away. That's going to take a minute. That's what I'm doing to Israel. I'm not going to stop burning and heating it up until it's fully cleansed, until my fiery wrath is completely spent. And then we get the second half of the chapter is about the death of Ezekiel's wife, used as a prophetic metaphor for the destruction of Jerusalem and specifically the temple, the light and pride of their life. And Ezekiel's not allowed to mourn. And I once heard this taught terribly in a marriage book about how you're supposed to take sorrow and grief, with a straight face and no mourning, and don't share your deepest feelings or some other kind of nonsense. And I remember reading this passage and going wait, this thing, his wife dies and he doesn't do anything. And then I went and looked more and I went, that can't be what that's supposed to mean. And it doesn't. This is a visual prophecy that higher than the very healthy, valid, and godly thing of mourning the loss of a loved one, especially your spouse. The right thing to do is to mourn that person. In this one instance, God says, Ezekiel, don't do that. I want you to hold off. I want you to hold off while this is under siege. And it seems that when he talks about it, it says, so I spoke to the people in the morning in verse 18, that probably is this prophecy about the cooking pot. And he says, and then in the evening, my wife died. The next morning, I did as I had been commanded. And when the people come, like, why did you do this? Then he starts explaining the two pieces. And now he shares, because this is how you're supposed to be. And I am assigned to you. And that's what's going to happen. And from then on, he's shut up until a messenger comes to tell them that the temple's been destroyed. Then his mouth is opened again. And the whole thing is just about showing them the Lord is saying, you do not get to mourn. Not because Ezekiel doesn't get to mourn, but just purely that Ezekiel isn't mourning. The Lord is saying to Israel, don't do it. You have no excuse to do it. If he didn't do it at my word, you don't get to do it, because he had his wife taken from him while he's just listening to me and doing the right things. You had the temple destroyed in Jerusalem because of your sin. You were in exile. You lost the temple and you were losing my grace because of your own sin and your relentless sin and turning away from me. Let us not be people who bring about the judgment of the Lord upon ourselves. All that it requires, all that is required of them at any given point is just to turn to him and listen, to turn to him, listen, confess, place our faith in God, not to turn to others, not to turn from one set of false gods and false ideas to worship and then turning to something else when that turns out not to work, but turn to the Lord, turn away from all these worldly ideas, turn away from everything demonic, turn away from worshiping ourselves or anything else we come up with, and turn back to the Lord at all times. If we would just do that, then there wouldn't be judgment on us. If we would just do that, and especially us knowing Christ, if we would just do that, turn back to the Lord, even after we sin, confess and turn back to the Lord. So that's what stands out to me today. I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and comments. And yes, I already know 23 is crazy. So how'd all this hit you? Were you able to find some truth and some goodness in this, some inspiration and maybe some warning and admonition, a reminder to follow righteously? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So share that in the chat. Let's talk about it. Thanks for reading with us. Be rad for Jesus.